Portage National Historic Site, one of two National Historic Sites in Illinois. This is Marquette and Joliet. They were the individuals who first wrote about Chicago. We've been doing these tours for a number of years. We do a tour the first Saturday of each month from May until November.
And why would you say it's important to know our early history of Chicago?
Well, it adds to why we are here, why we are at this location, and we can hear about some of the mistakes that early people made, the early settlers made, and we will try to learn not to follow some of the things that they did, but we will also find what they did for our early history and why they were important. When we do these tours, we do not necessarily talk about the physical geography of the ground. We talk about who came through here, who used this physical geography, why they were important to Chicago, and why this area was important in the development of Chicago. And please let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll try to speak loudly, but I will do my best today. First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming and visiting the Chicago Portage National Historic Site. My name is Jeff Carter. I'm with the Friends of the Chicago Portage. We're a not-for-profit, all-volunteer organization that works to improve the Chicago Portage National Historic Site, one of two National Historic Sites in Illinois. Does anybody know where the other National Historic Site is? No. Close.
Abraham Lincoln's home?
Yes, Abraham Lincoln's home. Abraham Lincoln's home and the Chicago Portage National Historic Site. First of all, I would like to discuss with you the definition of a portage. A portage is a connection or carrying place between two separate bodies of water. In the case of this portage, here was the connection between the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River. And these waterways connected Lake Michigan to the Illinois River, which in turn connected the Great Lakes, Atlantic Ocean, to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. And these individuals behind me are the first people to write about the portage. These are Marquette and Joliet. Now I tell all of my groups about this one tour that came through here one day. I was just hanging around and this guy came through in a bus and he got all the kids out and he said, "This is Lewis and Clark." No, this is not Lewis and Clark. This is Marquette and Joliet. You know, same stuff, same gang, but this is Marquette and Joliet. And Marquette and Joliet came through here in 1673. Now, that thought of Marquette pointed in the wrong direction. That Joliet stooped over, and that is an Indian guide who is representative of the Indians who showed Marquette and Joliet the way through. Now, Marquette and Joliet came through here in 1673. At that time, there were no roads, no highways, no trains, no buses. All people had to get around with were the waterways. The waterways were the super highways of the generation. You were on a waterway. When the waterway ran out, you had to get out, carry your canoes overland, carry your equipment from one body of water to the other. And this is another way of understanding what a portage is. It was the link between the two between the highway systems. Now, Marquette and Joliet came through here in 1673. At that time, there were two great imperial powers in this area. You had the Dutch and English on one side of the mountain range on the east coast, and on this side of the mountain range you had the French. Now, the explorers coming here were from New France. Does anybody know where New France was? Somebody say Quebec? Yes, New France was on the St. Lawrence River. And in order to get in, we were governed by New France. A lot of people don't realize that. My t-shirt here, matter of fact, says here, when New France governed the area. It was after Marquette and Joliet came through here to the end of the French and Indian War. So, the Frenchmen had to use the waterways to get into Indian country. And this was Indian country. This is where all the Native Americans lived. This is where you came to trade with the Native Americans. So, the Frenchmen used what we call the keys to the continent. The keys to the continent were the waterways. And one of the keys to the continent, which we will talk about today, is the Chicago Portage. All right, from southwestern tip of Lake Michigan, the early explorers would take the Chicago River. Where the Chicago River ran out, they would get out of their canoes, carry their goods, carry their equipment overland to the Des Plaines River, where we are right now. This was the Portage area. They would get on the Des Plaines River, follow the Des Plaines River southwest to where it became the Illinois River. Then they would follow the Illinois River further southwest to where it joined the Mississippi River at today's Grafton, Illinois. We will have a lot of this today, believe you me. Okay, at Grafton, Illinois, the early explorers would get on the Mississippi River. They would take the Mississippi River down to the Gulf of Mexico, and this was how they did it. This was actually the shortest walking distance between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River where we are today. Early maps of New France indicate Chicago as being located in this area because there was nothing on Lake Michigan. This was the area where the fur traders and the explorers were. This portage was not particularly difficult. No steep hills, no treacherous rapids, no horrible climbs. But this was a very, very, very important portage, as you will learn as we go down, look at some of the creeks, and so forth. This is only the western edge of the portage, but this is the only area that hasn't been drained, relocated, or lost. And if you close your eyes, not literally, but figuratively, if you close your eyes, try to ignore the planes, try to ignore the cars, try to ignore the porta potty, this is pretty much like it was when Marquette and Joliet came through here in 1673 on their voyage of discovery. All right, any questions up to now? I want to introduce you also to my friend back here. This is Jay Geico. He's going to do some demonstrations, and he will also field the questions that I can't answer. So Jake is a fur trade historian, and he's an author. And feel free to ask him any question as we journey down into the interior. Now, this tour today is a historical tour, okay? We're not going to talk about the weeds, we're not going to talk about the foliage, we're not going to talk about the trees and the birds and stuff. There are other tours that we sponsor that do this. We are mainly going to talk about the people who have come through this area, why they were important, and why they were important to Chicago and to the development of our area. And when we go to a certain site, I will say, this individual came through here then, this individual came through here later, and that is essentially what we're going to do today. So, it'll be about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. It won't stay too long in certain areas, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. I want you please to be careful as to where you walk. In other words, please don't slip, because we had somebody break her leg a couple years ago, which was so embarrassing. So be careful where you walk. If you see bugs and you're intimidated by bugs, I brought my trusty bug spray with me, so please feel free to ask me for the bug spray. Any other questions? Let's just proceed over to our first sign, okay? And we'll walk slowly, so be careful. Watch me slip. So we can see this sign right here. Okay, now these are the first of 5 scale interpretive signs that were put here in 2005 for the purpose of bringing this area alive. Prior to these signs being put here, this was just a beautiful forest preserve area, and you had no idea what had happened here and why the area was significant. But these interpretive signs will tell you what this area is about and what the Chicago Portage is about. Now, let's go back to 14,000 years ago. Let's take the Wayback Machine back to the time when this area was covered by a huge pool of glacial meltwater. Now, there was this giant glacier that covered 3/4 of the state. It's called the Wisconsin Glacier. Eventually, the Wisconsin Glacier, which is the size of the Hancock Building. Next time you're down in Chicago, look at the Hancock Building, and you can get some idea how high this massive ice glacier was. Eventually, the glacier started to melt. It started to move back to its source, which was in Canada. And as the glacier melted, it left this giant pool of glacial meltwater. Cold, icy. This area was just covered with this glacial meltwater. Now, these glaciers will sometimes leave debris called moraines. A moraine is a range of sand, gravel, and silt deposited by a retreating glacier. Now, the Tinley Valparaiso moraine was located essentially where today's LaGrange Road is. That's why when you go on LaGrange Road, you see all these high bluffs. That was the Tinley Valparaiso moraine. The glacier was further north and east of here, and the meltwater was trapped between the glacier and the Tinley Valparaiso moraine. This is the Tinley Valparaiso moraine. This is the glacier. Eventually, the glacial meltwater found its way over the moraine and started to surge southwest through 2 channels. The North Channel is where today's Sanitary and Ship Canal and Des Plaines River is, and the South Channel is where today's Calumet River is. And as this meltwater continued to flow southwest through these 2 channels, Lake Chicago lowered. In other words, the water was going away and Lake Chicago was lowering. Lake Chicago was the name of this giant pool of glacial meltwater. Okay, as more water flowed away, more land was uncovered. In other words, the water flowed southwest, more land was uncovered, and eventually we come to today's Lake Michigan. So this water would flow south and west, uncovering more land. Why this is important, what we're talking about, is that this became the route that Marquette and Joliet and all the early explorers used. This became how they came into our area. All right, believe you me, this will get about as complicated as it gets today. So, any questions up to now?
Could I ask you, Blue Island, wasn't it actually an island, you know, surrounded
Yes, Blue Island was an island. That's why they call it Blue Island. And eventually all the land surrounding Blue Island became uncovered, and it's no longer an island. And where the two streams joined together, right here, it was called the mighty Chicago Outlet River. And they said that the force of that river was equal to today's Amazon River. Okay, now, as more and more land became uncovered, the Des Plaines River turned around and started to flow into Lake Michigan, which was the name of Lake Chicago. However, at a certain time, a divide was raised near Kedzie Avenue. And what we had was what is called a continental divide, and this river could no longer flow into Lake Michigan. It turned around, re-reversed itself, and flowed southwest. The continental divide is the high ground that separates two bodies of water, each flowing in an opposite direction. Now, this continental divide was located approximately between 31st and Albany, today's Chicago, and 22nd and 11. If you look at all the maps, you see this high ground between these two areas. And we're just about done here. Okay, now the fun will start after we're done here, and the protest. Okay, so the continental divide was the high ground between two separate bodies of water. You don't think of a continental divide in this area, we call it a subcontinental divide. On one side of the divide, the ancient West Fork of the Chicago River flowed east into Lake Michigan, into the Great Lakes, and into the St. Lawrence Seaway. On the other side of the continental divide, the Des Plaines River flowed west into the Illinois River, the Mississippi River, and the Gulf of Mexico. Separating these two waters was the subcontinental divide, which is between Leavitt and Albany at its height, and a huge swamp called Mud Lake. Now, has anybody here ever heard of Mud Lake? I know geography people have.
Also called Berwick.
What?
Also called Berwick.
Bourbon, okay. right. Mud Lake, you can still find sections of Mud Lake, but Mud Lake was located between Harlem Avenue over here and the beginning of the subcontinental divide. And Mud Lake was this huge swamp. It was so difficult to navigate through Mud Lake. The early explorers would take the Chicago River and go over the continental divide. They would get into Mud Lake, they'd get stuck, and get out and carry their canoes through a gooey swamp, just like walking through cement. And Mud Lake went all the way up to Harlem Avenue, at which time they would get into Portage Creek, which we will see next. Portage Creek connected to the Des Plaines River. So, the Chicago Portage, a key to the continent, but at the same time, very difficult and unreliable. Sometimes it was not too difficult. Sometimes a lot of rain and Mud Lake was flooded. And you could go all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to the St. Lawrence River. You have to go over Niagara. You have to get around Niagara Falls, but you can still do it without getting out. In other words, you could go from the Des Plaines River to Lake Michigan without ever getting out of your canoe. This was about 2 months of the year when Mud Lake was flooded. At other times, it was more difficult. And when it was very dry, sometimes early explorers would have to use a portage road. The portage road went around the continental divide, went around Mud Lake, and came into this area, and we will show you where the portage road came in. So, sometimes it's even more difficult than that. Sometimes they'd have to walk all the way to Starved Rock. Has anybody here been to Starved Rock recently? Okay. Now you know it takes about 3 hours on the Stevenson Expressway down to Starved Rock. If you had to portage your canoe down there, it would take 3 weeks. And that was the difficulties encountered by our early explorers, our early fur traders, and the Indians who came before them. Now, Jake is going to talk about this real happy-looking individual here, and Jake is going to talk about how these people negotiated difficult portages. So, do you want to talk about that?
Morning. It's always an honor to be here and help Jeff. My name is Jake, and I do a lot of research in native peoples and also the fur trade. 200 years ago, if you were here, you might hear something to the effect of Buju Buju Mino Dapen Chicago on the Gami. There is hello, hello, welcome to the Chicago Portage. Because Jeff alluded to, this person here is called a voyageur. Typically they were French Canadians from Quebec, and they carried all the fur trade goods such as kettles and such as these earrings from 1600s all the way to about 1840. These earrings here are made out of silver. Most of them were made in Montreal by several silversmiths from 1770 to about 1830, 1840. These were worn by both the males and the females. So anyway, the native people, when the white man came, traded their beaver pelts for these earrings, rings, the kettles here, axes, knives, beads, you name it. And they were all contained in these bundles here. Each bundle weighed approximately 90 pounds. These voyageurs were like the mules of the fur trade. They were about this tall, very heavily muscled in their upper torso. Most of them couldn't swim. If you look closely, you'll see that they wore sashes around their midsection here, and that was to help them prevent hernias, because each bundle weighed about 90 pounds. So this voyageur has, at the top of his forehead here, it's called a tump line. These tump lines were attached to the bundles here, and that's how they carried them. They weren't backpacks, but just this one tump line here, and it was tied off here, and so all the weight goes onto the top of your forehead and not your shoulders. The record of a voyageur transporting bales like this was 5. So almost 90 pounds each, and he had 5 on his back at one time. A lot of times the voyageurs were also drowned in their canoes. They had portage their canoes between portages, or sometimes when they were paddling the canoe, they would try and negotiate some rapids, and the canoe would upset, drowning a few voyageurs and losing some of the bales. So this tump line here was adapted from the Native Americans. They used it extensively. The white man picked up on it, and like I said, they used it extensively. So this kettle here is about 160 years old. Kettles are made, for the fur trade from 1600s. Most of those are made in France and Belgium. Later on, in the 1770s, 1760s, they were also made in America, mostly Connecticut and the East Coast. So, as a woman, you want something to cook in. So how many beaver pelts would you need to buy one brass kettle like this? This is about an average size kettle. There were larger ones and there were smaller ones. Any guesses on how many beaver pelts to buy one kettle? No, that's way too. 10. About 5. 4 or 5 for this size. Contrary to popular belief, Native Americans were very astute consumers of goods. There's quite a bit of evidence where the Native people received shoddy goods. They didn't like that, so they complained, and there's quite a bit of evidence of the traders writing back to the big fur trade companies, such as American Fur Company, Northwest Company, and the Hudson Bay Company, demanding quality goods. And in most cases, the goods were changed to quality improved. So later on, we're going to do a little fire demonstration with flint and steel. It's not raining today, so we should be okay. Typically, the voyageurs used birch bark canoes. They were made with birch bark cut off the tree, sewn up with spruce roots, and the interior ribbing was usually cedar. And they would last about a year. However, they were very fragile. I get a kick out of the TV programs that depict some of the native people coming up, paddling a birch bark canoe and jamming it up on the shore. That was not the case. They would always stop in the water, empty out the canoe, and then gingerly drag the canoe up on shore so not to damage it. And if you look closely, you'll see the dark lines here. These were the seams that the birch bark panels were sewed together with the spruce roots. And the black you see here is spruce dung. It was mixed with charcoal as a waterproofing over the seams so the canoe wouldn't leak. Any other questions? Okay, we're going to go down to the Portage Creek.
Pointing the wrong way.
That's the way that the sculptor didn't know where he was going.
It's not Marquette's fault.
Yeah, it's not Marquette's fault. Right. Right. If anybody can find a time machine for me, I'd like to get one. You know, go back and check all this stuff out. So, but that was the sculpture's problem. All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. If you can't, raise your hand. Okay. Everybody hear me? Okay. This is the star of the show, Portage Creek. Portage Creek was the connection between the Des Plaines River and Mud Lake. Over there where you see the cars is Harlem Avenue. That was the end of Mud Lake at its highest point. And on the other side of the Beaver Dam is the ancient Des Plaines River. And this is Portage Creek with a little bottle of beer in it. So, this is not the Portage Creek that Marquette and Joliet saw, but this is the location of Portage Creek. Now, we will go and talk a little bit about Marquette and Joliet and why they are important in the story of the Chicago Portage. Marquette and Joliet were sent on their mission in May of 1673 for the purpose of discovering a direct passage from the Great Lakes straight west to the Pacific Ocean. Some people call it the Northwest Passage. They were supposed to find if the Mississippi River veered west into the Pacific Ocean. Marquette and Joliet left St. Ignace on the northwestern tip of Lake Michigan in May of 1673 from New France in 2 birch bark canoes with 5 voyagers. Jake has already explained to you about the voyagers, and Marquette and Joliet, they journeyed up the northern limb of Lake Michigan. They eventually made it to Green Bay, what now is Green Bay, and they found the Fox River in Green Bay. The Fox River was there and still is today. The Fox River is one of the few rivers that flows north. Marquette and Joliet got on the Fox River and they found this huge village of Indians, principally Miami Indians. The Indians warned Marquette and Joliet, which a lot of the early Native Americans did do to explorers. They said, go no further. Your life will be in peril. If you continue to go, you will find monsters who will devour you and your canoes. You will find savage Indians who will break your heads. And if you make it past the monsters and the savage Indians, you will find weather so hot and miserable it will turn you black and you will die. Father Marquette said, we are not worried about these things. I will go face your monsters, face your savages, because I am here to save souls. In Marquette's journal, he says he wanted to plant a seed in the ground which will bear fruit in time. Father Marquette was the priest of the voyage. He was there to convert the savages is how they called the Indians. Joliet was the one who wanted to find the route to the Pacific Ocean. Marquette and Joliet then were shown the passage, a portage to the Wisconsin River. And this is another one of the portages, another one of the keys to the continent. It's called the Fox-Wisconsin Portage, which is today at Portage, Wisconsin, okay? And they portaged from the Fox River to the Wisconsin River. Marquette, Joliet, the voyagers went down the beautiful Wisconsin River, and when they got at what now is Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, they entered the mighty Mississippi River. Marquette and Joliet got on the Mississippi River, hoping against hope that the river would eventually turn and go into the Pacific Ocean. When Marquette and Joliet got to a certain spot in what now is Iowa, they saw some Indian tracks. They put their canoes on shore, left the voyagers with the canoes, and then ventured following the Indian tracks. They found this huge village of Illinois Indians, and they were very, very worried, as it says in their journal. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. The Illinois Indians treated and feasted Marquette and Joliet like they were gods. They served them food, they gave them entertainment, and they even gave them a son of one of the chiefs to help them on their continued voyage down the Mississippi River. So Marquette and Joliet got back into their canoes with the chief's son. Some people say it was the chief's slave, and they continued their voyage down the Mississippi. When they got to what now is Alton, Illinois, they found this tremendous stone cliff with the lurid images of two monsters. Each monster was painted red, green, and black, and had the horns of an elk, face of a tiger, and a tail so long it wrapped around his fish-like scaled body. Marquette and Joliet were wondering maybe these are the monsters that they were talking about. And this was what is called the Piasaw bird. And today you can see the Piasaw bird if you go down to Alton, Illinois. It's not the one that Marquette and Joliet saw, because that was eventually effaced by time. But this was the tourist Piasaw bird. And when you go down to Alton, you see everything is Piasaw. You have the Piasaw drugstore, the Piasaw grocery store, the Piasaw this, the Piasaw that, the Piasaw pub. Everything is Piasaw down in that area. This is what Marquette and Joliet saw. They gathered up their strength. They continued down the Mississippi River, and all of a sudden, real trouble. A torrent of yellow mud, boiling, surging, sweeping logs, branches, trees, entire islands in its wake. Their canoes went round and around in a whirlpool. They held on for dear lives, and this was where the Missouri River enters the Mississippi, today's St. Louis. In Marquette's journal, which by the way you can get online, okay? Marquette's journal is online, and you can see where he mentions the fact that maybe this is the river, the Missouri River is the river that goes west, because it doesn't look like the Mississippi is going west, but they decided to continue down the Mississippi. And when they got to the Ohio River, the weather turned hot, miserably hot, swarms of mosquitoes. And they continued down, and then they were attacked by Indians. Now, Father Marquette had a calumet. Does anybody know what a calumet is? Peace pipe. Peace pipe, right. A calumet is a peace pipe, and this peace pipe was given to them by the Illinois Indians that they had first met. So they saw these arrows coming, they were holding this peace pipe, the arrows still kept coming. Some of the Indians jumped into the water, tried to swim to the canoes and overturn the canoes. You know, hey, all of a sudden, one of the old chiefs recognized this as indeed a calumet and said, okay, cool down, these are friends. So they invited Marquette, Joliet, the voyagers ashore, And the next day they went to another village and were told, no, the Mississippi does not go west. The Mississippi goes down into the Gulf of Mexico. Marquette and Joliet had found the answer to that question. They had found where the Mississippi goes. The Gulf of Mexico was entrenched with Spanish, who were at war with France, so Marquette and Joliet decided to return. This time they were going against the flow. They were going up the Mississippi, and they decided not to go all the way back to Green Bay, but to try this little stream that the Native Americans told them about. This little stream was today's Illinois River. They got on the Illinois River. They were amazed at the beauty of the landscape, the fertility of the soil, high blue skies, prairie flowers, birds everywhere. They were just stunned at the beauty of Illinois, as per what was said in Marquette's journal. They followed the Illinois River. They stopped at Peoria, preached to some Indians. They stopped at Starved Rock, preached to some more Indians. I imagine a lot of you have seen that picture of Marquette and Joliet preaching to the Indians behind Starved Rock. This was a portrait of this, what they were doing, not a portrait, a painting of what they were doing. They continued to follow the Illinois River. The Illinois River became the Des Plaines River. Of course, it wasn't called that then, but the Illinois River became the Des Plaines River. Followed the Des Plaines River to where it started to turn north. The Indian guides told them about this little creek that they could take. And this is the creek that they took, or this is the location of the creek that they took. And instead of going north on the Des Plaines River into the swamp of Wisconsin and into nowhere, they took this little creek here. They got in a mud lake. Mud Lake was high then. They sailed through Mud Lake. Then they had a portage for a little bit, probably the Subcontinental Divide. They portaged their canoes for about a league and a half. They got into the bucolic, pretty little Chicago River. That was then, okay? They got into the Chicago River, followed the Chicago River out into Lake Michigan and back to New France. Now, Joliet wrote that this is what his words were. It is that we could go to Florida, which is the Gulf of Mexico, in a bark and by very easy navigation. It would be necessary to build a canal by cutting through but a half a league of prairie to pass from the foot of Lake Michigan to the Des Plaines River. Okay, a league was 2.41 miles, and they portaged for half of that distance. So Joliet was the first person to write about a canal, the first person to understand the connection between the St. Lawrence River and the Gulf of Mexico, which would necessitate building a short canal of about a mile. So that's why this is important, and that's why Marquette and Joliet were important. Any questions up to now?
So you're saying this was about a mile?
Well, no. This was navigable, okay? And when they got to Mud Lake and Mud Lake went dry, that was where they would portage for less than about a mile. And it was over the Subcontinental Divide, probably. The Subcontinental Divide was the high ground that separated the Des Plaines River from the Chicago River. And I read a lot of old stories, old descriptions of this, and sometimes there was so much water that you didn't really realize where exactly it changed from one direction to the other. In other words, they'd be in the middle of the Mud Lake, and all of a sudden the water would be surging east toward Lake Michigan, and sometimes it was difficult to find. Okay, any other questions?
Where is the Des Plaines River relative to this?
Well, we'll get into that, okay? This is the ancient Des Plaines River over here. This is not in use anymore, thank goodness.